Good morning and thank you for joining us today. My name's Rob Woodward and I work in the content marketing team here at MorePay. It's my pleasure to introduce the topic for you this session, which is expert tips to shrink absenteeism, the masterclass session in our series on absence. In terms of agenda for this morning, Michelle will start off by talking about the cost of absence and understanding the true financial impact on your organisation. She'll then discuss managing complex absence cases, including how to prevent absence and strategies for handling long-term and reoccurring absences. We'll then move on to the Bradford Factor, exploring the good, the bad and the ugly, and how to use it within the wider world of absence reporting. Finally, Michelle will cover absence management software, including how to track absences, set triggers, and generate insightful reports. We'll then move on to the Q&A section where you'll have the opportunity to ask any questions. After the main presentation, we'll move on to the Q&A section of the webinar. You may have noticed your microphone is on mute, but we do want to hear from you, so please drop your questions into the question panel shown here. We've had an incredible response to this webinar, so I imagine we'll have lots of questions, but Michelle will do her best to get through as many as she can at the end of the session. Another note, if you're facing technical difficulties, don't worry too much. We'll be sending you all a recording. However, if you are facing technical difficulties, do flag it in the question panel, because if lots of them come flooding through, then I'll know there's an issue on my end and I'll do my best to fix it. Great, so before I hand over to Michelle, I'm conscious that we have people on the webinar that aren't familiar with MorePay, so I'll give a very brief introduction about who we are. So we provide payroll and HR software as well as outsourcing services to UK businesses. We've been around since 1966 and we have all the accreditations you'd expect. We're rated excellent on Trustpilot too. Our promise is to make payroll and HR easy, and here's how we do it. We've built payroll and HR software that's easy. We deliver quality outsourcing options, and all of this means worry-free compliance for businesses. On the slide, you can see some of the businesses who trust us to take care of their payroll and HR. And also, we are award-winning. We've won the Rewards Payroll and HR Software Product Award 2022 and the CIPP's Payroll Service Provider of the Year 2023. So that's enough about us. Let's meet today's presenter. So I'll start by introducing you to Michelle. You may have recognised if you've attended some of our webinars in the past. Michelle's our HR Services Director and has been with MorePay since 2017. She's CIPD qualified with 20 years of both operational and strategic HR experience. Michelle is responsible for running all HR services activities within MorePay. Good morning, Michelle. I will now hand over to you to get started on today's webinar.
Thank you very much, and good morning to everyone on the webinar today. Thank you very much for joining. So the focus for this webinar today is about absenteeism, and it is a huge topic. We're not going to get through all of it. We have done a more fundamentals version of this webinar, but this is really focused as a masterclass on some higher level, more strategic approaches. So this is about giving you practical strategies for managing absence in your business as part of our masterclass series. So on to the next slide. As HR professionals and business leaders, absenteeism is something that we have been talking about for years, and I certainly know that I have in my career, both as an operational HR business partner and more recently as the Director of HR Services supporting small businesses through MorePay. And absenteeism is something that requires different focuses and different ways of approaching. But I think for us as leaders and HR professionals, it's a topic that we need to continue to talk about and continue to focus on. But it also requires us to adapt to the different challenges that are faced at different times. And just really create an overall understanding of how important it is for businesses to keep their focus on this. And it is still one of the most common reasons why our customers at MorePay ring in for support. Absenteeism still continually is up there with one of the most talked about topics that we get. And it's felt really in the UK that the rate of employee absence is rising to almost the highest level in a decade. 4% of working time was lost on average in 2023. And absence, as we know, impacts all manner of things within a business, from productivity to morale to costs. And this is where I just really want to challenge us to start thinking about the strategic HR approach that sits alongside dealing with the everyday issues that happen. So on to talking about kind of costs of absence. So if we move on to the next slide. Thank you very much. So from a business perspective, I think it's the real critical lens that we need to view absence with. What is the actual impact to your organisation in terms of costs? HR, we are known for a lot of qualitative information, but it really helps the business and the strategies of the overall business if we can quantify some of the areas that we touch on and support with, and absence is one of those. So you're going to find many different studies on the internet, and it will come up with a lot of different figures, and it can be hard to get an accurate figure or data due to many hidden costs that you have with an absence. But if you look, there's a general agreement that in the UK in 2023, it cost the country over £100 billion, which honestly, it's just quite simply, it's staggering. So the research that we pulled out here is by Vitality, and it found that poor health at work was responsible for an estimated 138 billion. So another 38 on the kind of the lowest part figure we found. This is in hidden costs, but in their analysis, these are some of the interesting points that they pulled out. Mental health issues have the greatest negative impact on productivity, and this includes depression, fatigue, and burnout. Physical health factors can also contribute significantly, and this is areas such as poor diet, obesity, and musculoskeletal conditions. And interestingly, there also seems to be a generational divide happening, with employees under 30 losing 59.7 days a year, and largely due to mental health, and employers over 50 losing 36.3 days. That's such an interesting statistic to bear in mind. So why does it cost so much then? Thinking about both the actual costs and then some of the hidden costs that you might struggle to quantify a little bit more, but at least having them in your mind will help understand the impact it's having on the business. First of all, you think about temporary cover costs. So you've got to pay for an absent employee, whatever your sickness absence policy pay is. You've got to pay for the absent employee and potentially pay for temporary staff. There are certain jobs where you absolutely need someone to do that job, so you're recruiting temporary staff to cover that. And I think it's largely known that agencies charge hourly for temps. You've got to pay the additional costs, and they're likely to charge more, and this adds up very quickly. And that sometimes can be unexpected costs, which makes it even more difficult. If you think about lost productivity, there's time spent training temporary replacements to bring them up to speed, or training internal employees to try and take on more than they're already doing. They might not be their regular job. That is going to take time, and you're going to lose productivity whilst you're doing that. This could lead to work deadlines either being delayed or missed completely just due to lack of resource. And then if you think about the employee engagement impact, just generally in a team, if there is one person or multiple people off, and this is putting extra pressure on the rest of the team, this can impact the engagement of those employees and just make a real difference to their own productivity, let alone the productivity of the people who aren't there. And ultimately, all this can lead to customer impacts, and disruptions on productivity and increasing costs can affect the service quality, and it might be missed deadlines, mistakes, and in worst case scenarios, you're going to get lower customer satisfaction, and it may even lead to retention issues. So in terms of sort of sick days and trends, I think it's interesting to note that the average number of sick days taken in a year by employees has risen in the last few years, and we've sort of talked about that it's the highest in a decade, which is even more reason for us to talk about it. Even when you look at pre and post pandemic, there has been an increase in the average number of days from 5.8 to 7.8, and that's quite significant. And just to kind of cover where we are at the moment in terms of top reasons for absence, the short-term reasons cover minor illnesses, and this could be anything like coughs, colds, sickness bugs, musculoskeletal injuries, and mental health issues. But longer term, we're looking at things like stress-related absenteeism. And then when you look at the causes of the stress, heavy workload is by far the biggest contributor to work-related stress. And then below that is management styles and kind of a clash of management styles. We do actually have on our website a free absence calculator, which just helps you kind of take an idea of what it might be costing your organisation. So I really would encourage you to go and have a look at that and see if you can get more information to make the right decisions going forward. So the next area that I want to talk to you about then is thinking about a proactive approach. And we're going to go into some more sort of practical examples of how you manage some of the areas of absence. But before we do that, it is always worth stepping back and thinking about how organisations can take a bit more of a proactive approach and what preventative steps they can put in place to help manage absence at a higher level. It's, the age-old saying, prevention is better than the cure. And whilst absence is never going to dwindle to zero and be completely avoided because we live in a real world, there are things that employers and businesses can do to help keep those at a lower level. And if you think back to all the areas that we've said it will impact, this is all about your business performance and the real solid impact that lower absence can have on your business performance. I'll talk about this in a bit more detail shortly, but the first one is about having an absence policy, and I cannot stress enough how important it is to have and communicate a really clear absence policy, which outlines things like reporting procedures, available support, and ensuring employees understand what's expected of them and the consequences of not. But I do have a couple of slides on this shortly because I think it's really important to talk about it. Other ways that you prevent absence is when absences have occurred, look at the trends and patterns, understand the reasons that people are taking absences, and see if there's anything that you can do to address them to prevent them in the future. Make sure you're conducting back to work interviews using questionnaires, and then look at reoccurring problems that might be having. So in the previous slide where we talked about workload and management style, is the things that you can do in your organisation to change the approach to those and make those not a reason for people to be taking time off. And then it kind of goes without saying, but it's looking at employee engagement and how you boost employee morale. Happy employees are less likely to take time off. Think about the things that you can do to do this. Take a temperature check of your employees. Do you do engagement surveys or pulse surveys? Think about, can you arrange team building events or social activities, particularly around Christmas? I know in our own organisation, there's lots of different pockets of team building and social activities going on, and it's really nice to see the impact that these have. Think about benefits. Do you have a benefits provider? Can you offer health benefits like gym membership or healthcare? And then it's just about generally creating that positive, supportive workplace culture. I cannot stress enough how much these kind of small things can really help prevent absence in the future. Another one, it's sometimes controversial. It's something they do in schools as well. I know my children in school have rewards for good attendance, but it's something that you may consider and may work in your organisation, is looking at rewarding good attendance. Can you motivate employees with recognition or incentive, bonuses? But just ensure this aligns with your overall organisation's approach to absence management, and make sure that it does not discriminate against people who have a disability or an underlying condition, which means they might not be able to achieve the attendance. You need to think about making sure you've created a safe working place, so reducing the risk of workplace accidents, that you've got all the right health and safety policies in place, the right procedures, the right risk assessments, equipment's updated, and just ensuring that there's a safe environment overall. And then I think that the best advice that we could give you is to be realistic and flexible. Support employees with their own individual situations and what the personalised solutions to those would be. You might want to think about flexible hours, remote working, hybrid working, other ways that you can make people feel more supported at work and therefore less likely to take time off. And also think about tailored support for mental health or personal challenges. One other thing that I would probably say underlies all this when you're looking at ways to prevent absence, it's always a good idea to ask employees what would help them. Whether you've got a working group or you can do some kind of questionnaires or surveys, really ask the employees what would make a difference to them. There will be the underlying legalities or sort of employment law areas that need to look at, like an absence policy. And as I said, I'm going to come on to that shortly. But for all the other areas, what we're trying to do here is just give you a flavour of the things that you might want to consider in a proactive approach. But I can't stress enough how important it is to ask your employees what they want and get them bought into it. It's much more likely to succeed. So this brings us on then to talking about absence management policy and the real importance from the fundamentals of employment law to have an absence policy in place. So this would be your go-to document for situations where there are absence and that need some care and attention. If you haven't already created one, I really would say that this needs to be your number one action after this webinar, to think about how you could put this in place. I would suggest that you'd get some specialist report, but we do have an absence policy template provided after this session, which will help make things easier for you. So as part of attending this webinar, we can give you the basics of it. There are some areas of complexity that might need more support and guidance, but at least you've got the starting of it there. But in terms of what a absence policy would look like, so you understand what you're getting when you receive the template, if we just go on to the next slide, there's a breakdown. So what should your absence policy contain then? One of the first things, it may sound quite obvious, but this is all about really laying out the position of the company, and so that there's no ambiguity for your employees. And the first one is around reporting procedure. So how and when an individual should report their sickness absence, whether contact's got to be made each day or it's less frequently. Lay out what your expectations are and provide them with the information so they know what to do when it happens. Also cover what evidence they will need to provide, so for self-certification or when a medical evidence is needed, so a fit note, and also where you may require them to undergo any medical review, such as occupational health. The policy should be really clear about the consequences of failing to follow the procedure and or failing to provide evidence, which would mean that that was an unauthorised absence, and that should be really clear to them. You should also include details of pay, whether it's statutory sick pay or any entitlements to company sick pay, as well as the eligibility criteria for these payments. Talk about the return to work process. What are the steps for people coming back into work, post-absence plans, and there's a link here about the HR Fundamentals webinar, which really went into quite a bit more detail about this. If you haven't listened, I would recommend grabbing a cup of tea and listening back to that, where you can get more detail. It should also include things around best practice, where there's provisions for flexible working and potentially methods to support employee well-being, and also identify what your trigger points are. So your organisation needs to decide what they deem as unacceptable levels. Now, there's lots of information you can get through ACAS or through more specialised support like More Pay, where we could advise on what would be a decent or the appropriate trigger points to have in your policy. But what that means is that your employees know what's expected of them. So whether you say, 3 occasions in 12 months or 2 occasions in 3 months may result in an informal meeting with your manager. You need to decide what those trigger points are so everybody understands the consequences. So you're treating everyone fairly, you're treating everyone consistently. And that is really the whole point of the policy, is having it all out there, open and communicated for everyone. So The next area that I want to touch on, because absence is such a huge topic, and I've already said there's no way that we can completely cover in this webinar, and even between the fundamentals that we've done and the masterclass, there's just way too much to talk about. And as always, what we try and do is give you snippets of information from our own experiences within More Pay. And I think one of the areas that it's worth touching on is covering managing long-term absence and complex cases. So the outcome aim of someone being off on long-term sick with potentially a complex case, for whatever the reason, the outcome should be focused on bringing them back into work, so them returning. But it is a really complex area of law, and it can be really quite tricky to navigate without some specialist input, which is why we've chosen just to talk about it on here. So I've just pulled out some key strategies for managing long-term absence. And I think research shows that the longer an employee is off sick, the less likely they are to make a successful return. And there's quite a startling statistic that after 6 months of being absent, there is only a 50% chance of that employee making a successful return to work, which, going back to the thing that I said, this really should be the focus and the outcome. But there's some things that you can do to help manage long-term absence. This should form part of your employee absence policy, where you talk about how long-term absence is managed and will be the procedures that will be followed. But think about things like welfare. Start off with informal discussions which help you review their employees' health, their prognosis, what information you've got, what information they're willing to share with you, the likelihood of a return to work without too much pressure, understanding where they're coming from, but also allowing them to understand kind of what impact it's having on the business, but really focus on steps to support a successful return. There is also the area about medical reports, because one thing we all need to remember as HR professionals and as business leaders is we are not medical experts, and no one is expecting us to be when we are managing these. You need to look for the levers of expertise that you can pull. So it can be that you can ask for access to an employee's medical records, and there is the right to do this. Employees can withhold that consent, but it means you're making decisions without that medical information. And the other area is around occupational health. So occupational health is a service that many organisations use that can help give that kind of medical lens over a work situation and help inform the decisions of managing that long-term absence. And they will give you real practical advice. We do this a lot at More Pay to support our customers, and it's something that works really well and really helps us give much more sort of tailored advice on these situations. When thinking about people returning to work, there's also the look at reasonable adjustments, whether they are temporary or potentially permanent, and reducing barriers caused if somebody is off on long-term absence, particularly if they have a disability. So it might be things like specialist equipment, ground floor workspaces, modified duties, support, phased return to work plans. There's lots of different ways that you can encourage people to return from a longer-term absence. So talking a little bit more then about this phased return to work. When people have been off for a number of weeks or months, it can be quite a daunting thing for them to think about returning to work, let alone what any sort of medical conditions they may have that may mean phased return is a good way forward. So it's always something that I would encourage businesses to consider. So this can include returning to work on potentially reduced hours, lighter duties, or different duties. And as I said, this can be temporary, or it may be something that you could put permanently in place. But if someone's been on sick leave, say due to an absence that's affected their physical health and part of their job requires heavy lifting, as example, that element of their job would need to be omitted from their duties while they recover. But it might be that you collectively agree with the employee that if you remove that, they will be able to come back to work in some capacity and build up to their full duties. You need to be clear, though, on what the plan is, how long the phased return will last for, when the review points will be, what the future outcome is hoped for, and make sure that you have regular check-in points with them. You need to continue to review the employee's health, their well-being in the workplace, and it's all about trying to keep them in the workplace. And it might mean that you make some adjustments as you go through it. And then the last part of managing these more longer term absence cases or complex cases, is really looking at the medical capability process. Again, this should be part of your absence policy where you lay out how to deal with it. But sometimes an employee may have to stop working because of long-term health issues. And this is what we talk about, medical capability. They're not medically capable of continuing in their job. You may find that an employee resigns and says, look, I just can't do this anymore for whatever reason. It's always worth talking through with them, even at that point, are there any alternatives or adjustments that could be made? But the ultimate thing is you may have to consider dismissing them. I really would say that dismissal is the last resort, and you should consider as many ways as possible to help the employee back to work. And it's looking at the things that we've talked about, so getting medical reports from their GP, involving occupational health assessments, looking at whether they do have a disability, and if they do have a disability, what are your requirements under the Equality Act to make reasonable adjustments. And that's where medical reports and OC Health can really help you come to those decisions. But ultimately, you need to follow a medical capability process, and that you've been through the right checkpoints, the right reviews, that things are documented, that employees know what's going to happen in the next meeting, the things that you're going to talk about. And I really would recommend making sure that you've got some specialist HR support whilst you're going through that. But ultimately, if an employee cannot do their job before and there are no reasonable adjustments, then it may be fair for you to dismiss them, even if they have a disability. It's just something that needs handling with care because of the complexities around it. In terms of looking at overall absence, it's really important for organisations to have a way of reporting absences and the absence statistics. So I'm not talking here about how an employee reports their absence. I'm talking about how an organisation looks at their overall absenteeism levels and what methods they use to report. And this will advise you on how and when to handle absence issues. There are many different ways to look at absence reporting and kind of include it in your board packs and looking at percentages of absences, where the issues. But one of the things that I just want to touch on is the Bradford Factor. I'm sure most people on this call will have heard of the Bradford Factor. It was something that was developed in the 80s, and it quickly gained popularity as a tool for employees who were literally seeking straightforward and a simple way to manage absence. And it's worked out on this formula here. The Bradford Factor score takes into account the number of absences and the total of days absence, and will give each employee a score. And we do have quite a few customers of MorePay who use the Bradford Factor. It's used because it's simple to calculate, it's easy to implement, and it will flag attendance issues if it's applied consistently within absence policies. But as with everything, it comes with pros and cons. And the reason I've chosen to talk about this one specifically is it can be quite a controversial method, and there are some strong opinions in the HR world on both sides of the coin. And I'm just a firm believer that if you've got all the information about pros and cons, and here we've put it into the good, the bad, and the ugly, then you can make a decision on whether it's the right method for your business. The good, it identifies frequent short-term absences quickly and gives a real sort of pinpoint reference of flagging somebody who needs looking at. It provides standardised data and a real data-driven approach to managing absence. It helps businesses spot patterns and trigger absence reviews or intervention, and it's useful as part of a broader absence management toolkit. It also allows employees to know where they stand, and it's very clear kind of what the trigger points in there. Kind of the next part though, that what we've called the bad, it doesn't account for reasons behind the absence. It will just show you the score. It treats all absences equally, regardless of the cause. Sometimes employees may feel they've been unfairly penalised for what they deem to be legitimate absences, and it can, if not used correctly, foster a culture of mistrust. I think the bigger things to focus on here, though, is that it fails to differentiate with disability-related absences and therefore has the potential for indirect discrimination under the Equality Act. If it disadvantages disabled employees, employers don't make the right reasonable adjustments, and action is taken solely on the basis of a Bradford score without investigation. So I guess the caveat to this, and if we just go on to the next slide, is not to use this in isolation. I think it can be the first point to look at someone's absence, because the primary issue with the Bradford Factor is the lack of context. But used in the right way, it can be useful. It doesn't consider the reasons, and if you rely on it solely, just using the score, then that could be a potential issue within employment law. But what you need to do is make sure that if you are using the Bradford Factor, you keep a detailed record of all absences, the reasons for it, and the duration, and you bring those into the discussions. You conduct in return to work interviews to understand and support employees. You categorise the absences further into short-term, long-term, unauthorised, and you use the Bradford Factor alongside other tools and strategies to help you get to the detail. And the strapline that we've got here, I think it's just really important to remember that the context matters in this. Absences just more than numbers, and it's really delving down, if you're using this, delve down into the next layer. And then on the next slide, this is where we've really talked about the human approach. And this should be used alongside any method, but particularly alongside the Bradford Factor. A human approach is really important because if you are managing absence effectively, it is about understanding the individual and their circumstances. Whilst there are factors that we consider to be common amongst absence issues, every single person is going to have a slightly different take on it, and there's slightly different reasons. And it's really important to get to the underneath of that. And conversations are where you get to that information and uncover the real reasons. It is particularly important for employees who are dealing with mental health issues or chronic conditions that are going to be a much more tailored approach and tailored adjustments. And it really is about creating the right culture and having that human element and understanding that these are more than statistics and there's things that we need to understand. And it's just about trying to prioritise communication and a supportive approach. So to finish off then, and kind of an extension of talking about how you record, whichever method you use, including the Bradford Factor. And I do appreciate that I've given you an awful lot of information already. But what I want to do is make sure that we have plenty of time for questions at the end. I just want to talk a bit about HR software and how you can use this to report, manage, record, and monitor absence, and how this can help your business. So absence management software is some kind of software that's a digital tool that helps you to track and manage your employees' absence. And this is everything from holiday leave to sick days to parental leave. There's automation with it, so it will automatically record, monitor, and in a lot of cases help record, which will ensure that you are compliant and compliant with employment law and your own company policies. And often it works best when it integrates within HR and payroll systems, so there are streamlined operations. It's useful because it helps simplify for the HR team. I remember back in the days, many years ago, where everything was still recorded on paper in Excel spreadsheets, and trying to remember the last time somebody had time off and stitch it all together was near on impossible, especially as your business grows. So it really just does help simplify the process. And what that will give you is the ability to identify trends, whether that's individual trends or departmental trends, quite early on. And the quicker you get to these issues, the more likely it is you are to resolve them. It also can help manage remote working challenges around unplanned absences in a days now where we work in very different models to what we have done in the past. Having that absence management software and allowing people to have that overview, even when they're not physically in the office, can really help. So some of the key features of absence management software there. At the basic level, it does what it says in the tin, which is tracking leave requests online, and it can make it quite simple for employees to use. and it allows managers to review, approve, or in cases of holidays, etc., decline requests in the system. It will monitor attendance, so can track employees' attendance, hours worked, monitoring patterns, and supports the enforcement of your overall attendance policy. And it can automate the leave calculation. So there's a real-time update of leave balances based on accrual and usage for things like holidays, but then also can help with the triggers that you have put in place and potentially identifying when somebody needs some kind of intervention, and helping with the accurate calculations is really useful. The system can also host customizable policies where the rules are set for different types of leave, carryover. It is all about ensuring compliance with legislation and regulations. And as we all know, with the Employment Rights Bill consultation that is going on at the moment, there may be changes, or there likely will be changes to sick pay entitlement if day one rights come in. So things are going to get more complex. And what we're trying to do here at More Pay is make sure that we are well prepared for that. We want to talk about it a lot. We're going to keep talking about it for the entire period of the consultation so that our customers and people listening on this webinar feel that they are in the to take this on, whether that's through our service or through our software. It can also integrate with other systems in terms of payroll, so that you know that if someone's entered sick leave into the system, that it will automatically calculate. It's just all about streamlining processes and making things easier and allowing you as HR professionals and business leaders to concentrate on some of the more strategic things. Really useful tools around reporting and analysis. So if you've got all this data sat in the system and you have some kind of analytics tool that sits over the top of it, it will give you essentially your board pack information that you can roll up. It will generate the reports and absence trends, identify patterns, and then that will lead to you putting in actionable insights for your workforce planning. And also, if we think back to more the beginning of the webinar where we talked about proactive approach to absence management, I really do think that software is a key part of this. And another thing that employees really like, we live in a fast-paced consumer environment now where you can order your Christmas lights at 9 o'clock at night and they are there by 9 o'clock the next morning. People are starting to expect that in all aspects of their life. So self-service portals for entering leave or looking at pay slips, having apps for those kind of things. And this is where the absence management software becomes so much more than that. And then the overall benefits of using the software is, imagine it's about increased efficiency, better and more confidence in compliance, improved accuracy, enhanced employee experience, and a real data-driven quantitative insight, which I think is so important for us in HR to be able to provide that information. And then just around the HR reports in software, I think it doesn't surprise me this, but 29% of SMBs don't have technology that support their HR analytics reporting. But I think as time's moving on, these sorts of software app really need to be available to SMBs, even down in the micro space, to make their lives easier and the experience of their employees better. But a recent survey showed that organisations are wasting an average of 17 hours a week producing HR reports, which is pretty much 2 full working days. So getting that automated information, reporting and processes, it's just taken away from those manual reportings. And I think this is really the way that businesses need to go to help them succeed in the future. And just kind of finishing on that HR report then, the benefits of it all having in there, I've kind of touched on these all already, and so I won't read through it in detail, but it is like having almost a one-stop shop for your HR team to have their data at their fingertips and not need to pull it into Excel spreadsheets, put it into pivot tables, into graphs. It's all about accuracy, reduced errors, and a streamlined process. And I really do think for employee engagement overall, it's a real win. It's boosting their own experience and just building a general positive workplace culture. So I appreciate that I have given you a huge amount of information in the last 40 minutes. It's hard to pick a limited number of topics on something such as absence, but I hope that has given you a flavour of things to take away, think about. When you get a copy of the recording, maybe you can listen back over to the bits that particularly interest you. And then think how you are going to take this forward. But I'm going to hand back to Rob now to see what questions we have.
Lovely, thank you, Michelle. That was super insightful. That was really great. Thank you. So we've got quite a few questions in here. The first one is, how would you record if an employee has a health condition or disability to help you manage absences? Would you ask employees on an annual basis to update any records, or is this not recommended?
It's a difficult one, and probably needs some specialist advice on it. You can do things where you ask employees to fill in equality data, but that is usually anonymised. So you can look overall in your business, and that's something that we recommend to our customers, that they ask equality-based questions, but they should be all anonymised. If you suspect an employee has a disability, and bearing in mind that it isn't easy to decide whether someone has a disability or not, and we are not medical professionals, I would just say that you need to continue to have open and honest conversations. If someone is having either frequent absences or a long-term absence, that you ask them to be open and honest about the reason that they have their absence. If they are open and honest, then that can of course be recorded in the system as the reason for the absence. And then I would suggest that you get occupational health involved or access to GP reports for what does that mean. We certainly don't want to be making any decisions over yes, you have a disability, or no, you don't. We need some medical intervention. So I wouldn't say that we should be asking people on an annual basis for them to for us to then record it. You can ask the anonymised, so you know the makeup of your organisation, but individually, if they are off frequently, ask them for the reason, and then you have a legitimate reason to record that, and you may use it in future sort of future reviews with them.
Oh, brilliant. Perfect. Lovely. And someone else has asked, what's the best way to deal with an unauthorised absence, i.e. when no communication from absent employee?
Yeah, so I guess there's two lenses to this. The first is if you're having no communication from an employee and they have not turned up for work, the initial thing should be a concern for their safety. So if someone has just not turned up for work, there's no reason for it, you can't get in touch with them. I would try and follow a procedure where you make various attempts to get in touch with them, and if you can't, you may even want to try their next of kin. Because unfortunately, and I'm sure many people on this call who are in HR organisations have been in the awful situation where very rarely, but it can be a safety issue that someone has not turned into work. So that's the first and foremost thing, is making sure that individual is all right. If they stroll in the next day as if nothing has happened, or if you do manage to get in touch with them a few days later, then you have to decide whether they have a real and legitimate reason for not following the normal procedure. If you think they don't have a legitimate reason, then you can follow your own internal procedures, which may take you down some form of disciplinary route for an unauthorised absence. Again, take specialist information. If you're confident there's no safety issue, for example, someone else in the office says, well, I spoke to them this morning, I don't know where they are, but they're fine, and they just don't turn in, then there is the AWOL procedure that you would follow, where you would give them a chance to come in, respond, invite into meetings, but you can follow a separate AWOL process.
Perfect. Lovely. And we've got another one here. Is it better to have a trigger point as a number of instances or the number of days?
I think it's a combination of both. Unfortunately, there are so many levels of complexity. I think you need a combination of both. So, for example, your policy could be something like an absence review will be triggered if you have more than 2 occasions in 3 months, more than 3 occasions in 12 months, or more than 10 days in one go, that will trigger an absence review. But what that absence review will allow you to do is think, what's the next step? And it might be, yes, they've had 10 days, but I don't know, it was a broken leg, it was a one-off, and you think, okay, we'll just keep an eye on the situation going forward. But I think it's a combination of both that you'd need to have. There's certainly lots of places you can look, and our teams here can give advice on what may be appropriate triggers, but figuring out what they are and communicating them to employees just really sets. People tend to operate better when they know what's expected of them, and it doesn't come as a shock. You know that you're treating everyone fairly and consistently, even if you've got to go down the layer of actually your situation is different to this situation over here, but you've got those standard trigger points in place. So I'd say a combination.
Great. We've got, I think, quite a tricky one here. We've got someone has said, we've recently moved to a requirement of 60% office attendance and seen a large increase in OH referrals for people seeking medical guidance, that they now require to be home workers for a variety of health reasons. How would you handle this sensitively to challenge the content in the OH reports and encourage a return to the office while preventing any absences?
Yeah, it's a great question, and something that a lot of organisations have seen. I know our customers have brought in, they're sort of asking us a very similar question. We've seen it quite a lot. It's a great question, but it's a complex one, and each individual will have something that you need to look at for them personally. So I can't give you a blanket answer of this is what you need to do to solve it all. I think you need to look at everybody's individual circumstance. You certainly can challenge the OH, because whilst we are not medical professionals, you can ask for clarification, and the OH will go off obviously what the employee tells them. I think that you need to look at each individual case on its own, but then there's probably a bigger thing where you can step back and look at what you can do to encourage people back into the office in terms of kind of consulting with them, easing them into it, incentivizing people to come into the office. I think there's probably a bigger strategic piece about encouraging people back into the office, and then that will leave you to deal with individuals who believe that that does not apply to them for whatever reason. Get the right information, then deal with each one on a case by case basis. But there are lots of things you can do to encourage people back in at a higher level, and also talk to them about what would encourage them to come back into work, what would make their life easier. And it might be something as simple as a change in start and finish time to help them manage the traffic. I don't know, it could be somebody who has back issues and says it takes me an hour to get into work during rush hour and I can't sit for that long. But if they came in half an hour earlier or half an hour later, the traffic dies down. It's looking at those individual circumstances and asking them what would make a difference. But you certainly can challenge watching occupational health. But yeah, I would seek some support on that. That's a tricky one, but a very common one at the moment. I wish I had the magic answer.
Okay, and then we've got another one here. How is it best to approach sickness / long-term sickness absence during the probation period? For example, reasons, lapse to addictions, etc.
Okay, so during a probation period, there's a few questions in there. During a probation period, you would still follow an absence procedure, but obviously it's something that you may be able to follow a slightly shortened version of the procedure because they are still within their probation period. I definitely would seek advice on this one because there will be lots of nuances. Because you've mentioned addiction, that might be something that is considered long term, a potential disability. And it all depends on how much you knew at the time of interview, how much you know now, what the outcome is for recovery, what you can do to support. It may be that you decide to extend their probation. There are lots of different options here, but I don't think there's a blanket answer without knowing the detail of it. I would seek specialist advice on that. Because like I said, that at a black and white level, if someone is still in the probation, you can usually do shortened procedures or shortened versions of your procedures while still following ACAS code of practice. But the addiction piece throws in a bit of a curveball that needs to be handled with care and respect.
Okay, brilliant. And then we've got quite a bit of an interesting one here. What would you do? What would you recommend the best wording to use to approach someone who's suspected of being intoxicated whilst at work?
Okay, that is a difficult one, but it's something that needs to be handled and sort of faced front on. Now, there are some organisations who have specific drugs and alcohol policies that allow you to test, but obviously that has to be known in advance. I've worked in organisations before where that was something that was introduced, but it was introduced and everybody knew that if you were suspected of being intoxicated at work, that you could be taken into a room and asked to submit to a test. They didn't have to submit to it, but they were asked to take one. If you don't have that in place, and you suspect that someone is under the influence, I would still follow the process of taking them into a room, talking to them, asking them open questions. And if you feel there is a risk to their safety or to the safety of others in your organisation, then you can ask them to leave that day pending an investigation. I would say make sure that they get home safely, order them a taxi, don't leave them to drive. And then you would need to seek advice and follow a proper investigation process for a disciplinary, because obviously being intoxicated at work could potentially be gross misconduct. So you could ask them to leave work. You might even suspend them from work. Take advice if you can, although I know, and I have been in these situations as an HR person where you've got to make a very quick decision. I have had in the past someone who was suspected of being intoxicated whilst driving a forklift truck. So there was no time to do anything other than get them away and follow our procedure. So I would take the advice, follow a thorough investigation and procedure. And the thing that I would caveat is always remember employment law is about having a reasonable belief that something happened and that you come up with an outcome that was within the band of reasonable responses. So you don't have to have physical evidence that they had a certain level of blood in their alcohol through a breath test. That doesn't need to be there. But the way you would get to that is by conducting a really full and thorough investigation, by talking to them, talking to people who are around them, and then deciding what course of action takes place. But it can be a very complicated thing to deal with, because you might not only be faced with someone who is intoxicated in work, that might lead to them opening up about an addiction problem.
Okay, thanks, Michelle. And we've got another one here. Employees who only receive SSP requests to use unpaid leave or use a holiday, can these dates still be used when assessing their absences, focusing on short term?
Yeah, this is a tricky one, because if you as a company allow people to take holidays instead of sick leave, it will skew your results, because it will look like a holiday and not a sick leave, and it makes it more difficult to manage. I understand why employees will ask this, because they don't want to lose the pay. But I would say if you are going to do this, tread carefully, because it can make it more difficult to include that the actual reason you're dulling down the reason for that absence, which makes following your own internal procedures around trigger points and how many absences, it's not impossible, but it makes it a lot more difficult. So it's something that I personally think should be personally avoided, but I do know it happens, so just tread carefully and know it may make it more difficult further down the line because you're masking the reasons.
Okay, lovely. And then we've got another one here. What happens when a person seems to have a very bad year? So that could be bereavement, sickness, childcare issues amounting to a significant amount of absence. How could we address this?
It sounds like for something like that, there's lots of different reasons for absence that aren't just around sick leave. So I would tend to say that bereavement leave, if you have a bereavement policy, that I would take that out of absence triggers, because it's something that you've agreed sort of from a compassionate perspective. Childcare issues, obviously there is the right for parents to take time off when needed, but I do understand that it can become difficult. I would focus on the ones where you have got a real reason for sickness absence, and then maybe include other things around it. But I would very cautiously I'd suggest that you are very cautious about the compassionate leave, that should be taken to one side. You can look at it in the round, but again, I would seek specialist advice. Also look at their overall record. If it is just a bad year, it doesn't mean that you can't do anything, but you might follow a longer process than you would with someone who just started this year and has had such a bad year. Look at their overall, over the past few years, what their absence levels have been like. Unfortunately, some people do just have years like this. Don't be afraid of following policies. I would generally say that you start with following the right policies, but you may make a judgment call whilst you're going through those procedures, that you might invite them into a meeting where part of your process is that this could result in some kind of warning. But during that meeting, you may say, taking everything into the round, we are not going to issue a warning in this meeting, but this is our expectations going forward.
Lovely, brilliant. And we've got time for one more question here. So this one is how to deal with a capability issue if an employee declines consent for occupational health assessment.
Yeah, that's always really difficult, and if I'm being brutally honest, can feel quite frustrating as an HR person, because you want to do the best by them, you want to get all the right information, and as I said, quite happy to stand up here and say that I am not a medical expert, and it feels very difficult making those kind of decisions. The only thing you can do is encourage them, give them the reasons why you want that information, what you will do with that information, and lay it out very clearly. If they refuse to give their consent to access to medical records or occupational health, you need to tell them that you're going to make the decisions going forward. So if you are in a medical capability process, or you're looking at short-term disciplinary type action, that you're going to have to make the decisions based on the information in front of them, which is what they tell you and what you know from them. Again, seek specialist advice. I know I say this a lot, but there's so many nuances with all these examples, and they are brilliant questions. It's hard to give the blanket answer without knowing the detail. But I would seek advice, but make sure they know that you're going to have to make the decision on what's in front of them, in front of you, and in front of them. And that may not be the right thing to do, because you've got part of the jigsaw missing, essentially.
Okay, great. Thank you so much, Michelle. That was incredible advice, and thank you so much for everyone who asked questions as well. So that's us wrapping up the webinar today. I'd just like to point you all in the direction of our Knowledge Centre, which is easy to find in the menu on our website. It's packed with lots of helpful resources, including upcoming webinars, guides, and blogs, plus everything is free to download. If you'd like to find out more about our HR and employment law services, please drop us a message into the Q&A panel, and one of our colleagues will contact you. Our HR advice line runs 24/7, 365 days a year. So no matter when a HR issue crops up, best practice employment law advice is always available over the phone anytime, delivered by our highly experienced team of qualified experts. And then we know you're at this webinar because you care about making a difference in your workplace and achieving your HR goals. You want to reduce unnecessary admin so you can concentrate on the bigger picture and attend more learning opportunities just like this one. Well, with MorePay's easy HR and payroll software, you can have a clear inbox, reports running, and payroll approved all before your brew break. Our software automates everyday tasks so you can win the day. If you want to learn more, just search MorePay's HR software. And then finally, we've got our HR leadership quiz here. If you follow us on social media or subscribe to our emails, you might have seen this launched already. But I'll include a link to the quiz in our follow-up email. So have fun with it and just take a couple of minutes to find out which HR leader you are. And then before you finish, you will see a prompt to fill out a poll where we will close the webinar. We're just looking for some opinions and insights to help us tailor research, resources, and content from our listeners and readers. So if you've got a few seconds to complete that poll, we would really appreciate it. That's everything from us. Everyone who registered today will receive a recording of the webinar and a copy of the slides. You'll also receive some free, exciting resources on absence over the coming weeks, including downloadable templates like the ones mentioned in this webinar. So keep your eyes peeled for that. And if you're interested in attending any more of our webinars, then please just keep an eye out as we usually run them on a regular basis. That is everything. Thank you so much for attending, and I'm now going to close the webinar. Thank you.